what has happened since October 7th, as an indicator of this destruction, or a society that is in deep, deep trouble. And the society you're speaking of is the West. That's America, Australia, all of Europe, Great Britain, of course. Why don't you explain to me what you consider that metaphor of the canary in the coal mine and the persecution of Jews, especially in Western societies, and what that means to those societies?
By the canary in the coal mine, when this applied to the Jewish people, what is meant is that when a society turns on its Jewish community, that almost invariably shows that the society is in a great deal of trouble. I think what we've been living through in the West since the October 7, 2023 atrocities in Israel, I think we've been living through a rather dramatic illustration of that metaphor, the canary in the coal mine. Because one would have expected that in the wake of this terrible set of atrocities that happened on October 7, in which Israelis were not only murdered, but slaughtered in the most barbaric and depraved fashion, with women raped, with children murdered in front of their parents, with women, children, and men beheaded, some of them burned alive, and then a number of them dragged back into Gaza, both dead and alive. One would have expected that the world would have, the civilized world, would have understood what Israel was facing and would have supported it in its attempt to defend itself. Because, of course, it wasn't just a one-off event. The people who perpetrated this, who were Iran's proxies, one of Iran's many proxies in the Middle East, the Hamas, made it absolutely clear, they said in terms, that they intended to carry on perpetrating such atrocities over and over again until Israel was destroyed and every Jew was killed. Now, Israel was thus up against a genocidal enemy. And one would have expected that the West, with the cultural memory of the genocide of the Jews in the Nazi period, still very much in people's minds in terms of their sort of cultural memory, one would have expected the civilized world to have understood exactly what Israel was facing and to have supported its attempt to protect itself against this attempted genocide and to destroy the Hamas as a military force. But instead, that didn't happen. Instead, we saw a widespread movement across the West of people taking to the street, screaming for the destruction of Israel, screaming for the murder of Jews, screaming for not just action against Israel, but jihad against the West. And we saw systematically through Western governments, some of which actually purport to be sympathetic to Israel, and certainly much of the mainstream media in the West, a narrative of falsehoods and distortions designed to demonize Israel, pouring forth every day, accusing Israel of crimes such as genocide, of a crime that it was actually suffering from, totally untrue when it comes to Israel. The crimes of ethnic cleansing, totally untrue. Crimes of the crime of war crimes in targeting and killing innocent Gazan civilians, totally opposite of the truth. In other words, we saw in the wake of this terrible set of atrocities, instead of expressions of sympathy and support, which would have expressed conscience and a proper moral sense of right and wrong, justice and injustice, victim and aggressor, we saw that the West was turning all that inside out. It was calling the victim the aggressor and the aggressor the victim. It was calling justice injustice and vice versa. And it was telling lies. And so what seemed to me to have happened was a wholesale repudiation by the West, by Western elites, I should say, in their response to October 7, a wholesale repudiation of conscience, justice, and reason. And it occurred to me that this was precisely the conclusion I'd come to about the West itself, having done to itself over many decades precisely the same thing, eradicated justice, reason, and conscience from itself, because over many decades it had been basically attacking the very essence of the West, the core foundational values of Western civilization, the core component of the Western nation state, telling itself that the West was born in the original sins of colonialism and racism and white privilege and all of that, taking an axe to the institutions that perpetuate a culture. The education system as a transmission of cultural memory through the generations, the traditional family as the best mechanism for ensuring the perpetuation of healthy individuals, psychologically healthy and balanced and self-motivated individuals who can cope with the world, and against the nation state itself as having to be defended as the means to protect all those wonderful things that the West tells itself it so values. And so it seemed to me that the reaction to the October 7 atrocities was indeed the Jews once again playing the role of the canary in the coal mine. That what was happening to them in terms of the West's reaction was sounding a tremendously loud warning about what the West was doing to itself.
The West was given a choice, an option of choosing barbarity or civilization, or just the rejection of civilization, and we chose poorly. I don't think that. Well, you say that the West does not any longer understand what civilization is. What does it mean? So why don't you jump right in and define it for us?
Well, civilization, it has really two meanings, doesn't it? We can talk about Western civilization. We can talk about ancient civilizations. In other words, civilization in that context is simply a way of, it's a sort of category that you describe. It's another word for a culture. But by civilization in this context, I mean something different. I mean civilized values. Now, what do I mean by civilized values? Well, the values that we in the West tell ourselves are so obvious, we sort of take them for granted. So being compassionate, having conscience, personal responsibility, seeking to put the welfare of others above yourself, living in an orderly fashion by the rule of law, seeking to constrain personal appetites so that you don't have anarchy on the streets or in personal life. Being tolerant of others, but not being tolerant of bad things, having a sense of justice, right and wrong, holding people to account, holding yourself to account, things like that. I would say those are, and we can all think of other principles, I'm sure, but those sorts of things I think we assume are civilized, that if you don't adhere to those values and the way of life that all those things imply, it's not really a civilized society. If you have a society, for example, or a situation where, people are behaving in a debauched and degraded fashion on the streets, there is no sense of, personal modesty. People are going around looting shops, stealing from shopkeepers, with no attempt to police this. If you have people who are behaving in an utterly selfish way, so that there is no compassion, there is no charity. Old people, poor people are left to die in neglect. This is not civilized. And what we on October 7 was not just not civilized; it was actually barbaric. By which I mean that it wasn't simply that the Israelis who were targeted in this way were being murdered. They were being murdered in a way which was sadistic and, I would say, psychopathic. The people perpetrating these atrocities were actually taking great pleasure in torturing. Burning children alive, murdering children in front of their parents, and what they did to the women not just raping them, but mutilating them and taking pleasure in the pain and the suffering. Now, that is, that is barbaric. That is barbarism. And, one has to choose one's words carefully. These are words which should not be used lightly. But I think in these circumstances, they're absolutely apt and appropriate.
Barbarism is perfectly appropriate for that. Let me just ask you about this stuff. So we have the West and Western civilization. And we're defining civilization or civilized cultures as holding to certain standards, which you rightly say we tend to take for granted. That's just, we live it. We've always lived it. We weren't there when this was discovered or being founded or established. So it's just part of almost our cultural DNA. And we tend to forget, I think, in the West, that not all cultures embrace the same set of standards. These standards, the ones that you just listed, to me are sort of like, well, of course, right? There are some things that you might debate and say, well, we've got to struggle with this question. But this, in a way, they're high ideals, but they are a minimum standard, sort of in an opposite or an oxymorph way. But other cultures do not embrace all or most of those standards. And so my conversations, and later today I'll be talking to Eric Metaxas, it's about this civilizational questions. And what I want to do is take it from, as they say, shift the Overton window, as Donald Trump's always doing, like throwing a bomb out there and saying, we need to start talking about this in a different way, unembarrassed, unafraid, just as importantly. And the question that I have, or that I want to talk about more of, is religion and its place in civilization, its defining place in civilization. And I don't care if when I criticize or critique a religion or a cultural practice, if they call me racist, even though I'm talking about a religion or culture that has nothing to do with race. And so I'd like you to talk a little bit about that cultures that do not embrace, or religions that do not embrace, the set of standards that we've held ourselves to in the West, but we are abandoning, clearly.
Indeed. I mean, you're absolutely right. Religion is central. I mean, I'm speaking to you from Britain, where I was born and bred. And people in Britain have a very different attitude to religion from America. I have to put that out there to begin with, because Britain is really a post-religious society in a way that America is not. America still has a very large section of the population who are biblically faithful, religious people. Okay, it's being eroded all the time. The forces of secularism are marching in America as they are elsewhere, but it hasn't got to the state in America that it has in Britain. But I think you're absolutely right that people in the West generally assume that the sort of things that you and I and others would assume are axiomatically civilized are kind of imprinted in our DNA. We're kind of born with them, and they are universal. And it's absolutely untrue. There are many, many cultures in the world which don't have these values, which are cruel and brutal which people are cruel and brutal to each other. They don't have the sense of justice that we have. They don't adhere to the rule of law. They certainly don't have democracy. They don't have personal freedom. All these things that we take for granted are not universal at all. They are particular to the West. Now, why did the West have them? Well, many things went to create the West. But in my view, the core reason why we have these great things that we call civilized is because of the role of religion. Now, we all know that the foundational creed of the West is Christianity. You know, the West was founded upon Christianity, and it's Christian ethics and Christian principles and And the history of Christianity is threaded through the history of the West. But Christianity didn't come from nowhere. Christianity came from Judaism. And what people are amazed to find out and try to obscure to a large extent is that some of the things that we take for granted about the way we organize our lives in the West, not just our personal lives, but our political lives, were actually concepts introduced by the Hebrew Bible, which were revolutionary at the time. I'll give you just two to do with, more than two. Things like putting other people first, a sense of personal responsibility. These things are intrinsic Christianity, but they were invented by the Hebrew Bible. But it's not just to do with personal ethics and morality, where the Bible has been so absolutely fundamental. People are amazed to learn that in my view, two core principles behind what we now know as democracy also came from the Hebrew Bible. These were the idea of limited government, that the ruler, the king, could not be a despot, although I'm afraid some of the ancient kings of Israel were.
Sure.
But nevertheless, the template was
it's always going to be somebody breaking the rule.
Oh, always. But the template was that they were not despotic because they knew that they were not the ultimate ruler. The ultimate ruler was God. So there was someone above them who was the ruler. And at their level, they were constrained in turn by people called judges and prophets. So, okay, it was nothing like we have today. But nevertheless, that principle was very important. The second principle, which was, I think, equally important, if not more important, was the idea that the laws by which the people are governed have to be rooted in the people's consent. When Moses gave the law to the ancient Israelites, he said to them, "Do you agree?" And they said, "Yes, we will do this." And that was absolutely central. Those two things, limited government and the rule of law founded on the consent of the people, was so important that when in the 18th century, jurists and constitutionalists in Britain developed what became Britain's constitutional monarchy, in which the power of the king was constrained by Parliament. Parliament became the sovereign ruling body of the country. And those very people who were Puritans, they were evangelical Christians, and a number of them went across the Atlantic and founded America, and they brought with them those concepts, and they founded America and America's Constitution, broadly speaking. And the founding fathers of America, as you all know better than I, went on and on about the Hebrew Bible. They drew upon it explicitly over and over again. It's absolutely intrinsic to America.
Factoid, you probably know this. I'm sorry.
I'm just going to say these things are crucial to the West.
They are. A little fact that I don't know if it's lost on most people, but the founding fathers quoted, a huge study was done gathering together, 27,000 of their quotes. And, Montesquieu, Locke, the whole gang. But they quoted God from the scriptures more than any other individual writer, if you will, and the book of Deuteronomy was number one, which is one of my favorite books. And so they did bring this all into our constitutional republic. And I think that most Americans, and certainly most British, don't really understand the depth of our reliance upon the Holy Scriptures as a foundation of our society.
Exactly. I mean, secular people who are very detached from religion not only don't have religion in their personal lives, but they don't understand it. They don't understand its power, both for good and ill. So this is very striking to me because it means two things. First of all, they don't understand their own culture, and they don't understand the dangers from people who are impelled by religion in the worst possible sense. And I mean by that Islamic radicals, people who are in the Islamic world who interpret Islam in such a way as to believe that they have a duty to Islamize the rest of the world. Now, what is so striking about those people is that they understand absolutely that without a religious base, society is nothing. That a religious base is what kind of creates the framework, the principled architecture of a society. It gives it its fundamental values. And that if you don't have religion, you don't have a coherent framework at all. And if you don't have that basis of a civilization, of a society, then it's a hollow thing, and it's open. Therefore, it's a kind of vacuum. It's a kind of philosophical and theological and moral and practical vacuum in a society, which is then capable of being filled by actors, bad actors, who see their opportunity. And that's precisely what the Islamists, people who are Islamic radicals, understood, that the West, because it was evacuating its own society of meaning and purpose, it no longer knew what its principles were, where they came from. It no longer liked the principles that it had inherited. It wanted to get rid of them and replace them by something completely different. And it was certainly, therefore, not going to be prepared to defend its society and those principles. Therefore, it was open for the Islamists to say to come in and fill that gap. And so, not only does the West not understand how vulnerable it's made itself to these outside actors, but it doesn't understand that in order to defend itself, it has to reconnect itself to those principles, which is what my book is trying to say, that without religion, a society is nothing. Now, secular people hate to hear this. They will deny it to the nth degree. They will say, we got our great values from the Greeks. Well, really? I mean, the ancient Greeks weren't exactly humane, caring, and compassionate people. It's absurd because, they don't know about religion. They don't want to know about religion. They are incapable of understanding how religion, is a force for a fundamental good, and how, in the hands of fanatics like the Islamists, it can be a force for fundamental evil.
If you don't have religion, that's where Marxism is very welcome, because if you're an atheist, then God is not God, government is God, and man is God. So you've got your Marxist ideology, or whichever form of communism or socialism you choose. Then you have Judeo-Christian values based on the Hebrew, Greek scriptures from the Christian perspective, and it's based on the Ten Commandments. The one God, Jehovah, is based on the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it's a cohesive whole. When in the New Testament, when it says "Love thy neighbor as thyself," it is clearly coming from Leviticus. They didn't just make that up. And then you have an Islamic society, and there are up to 57 of them, 22 in the Arab world. And those are based on a different text and an entirely different worldview. And then you have, there's a bunch of others, but then Hinduism, which is based on the Vedas, and a caste system. So there's four of the most profound or populous of cultural, religio-cultural structures that you could work within. And so we can't just say, right, I would not just say that it's religion that makes a culture good. It's a religion that defines what that culture is going to be. Like in your book, I think you mentioned that law, traditions, customs, literature, language, religion, all make up a culture, right? All define a civilization and a culture. And so in Islam, you're going to have Sharia. And you don't have to be wielding a sword and cutting off people's heads in downtown London and be an Islamist to believe in Sharia and structure your society around it. Same thing with Hinduism, and the same thing with Marxist atheism. So we have to, I think, have the conversation that our culture, or whether or not we're willing to accept that we have to start discussing our cultures in the West as Judeo-Christian cultures, and not be afraid to say that, a Muslim is not afraid to defend his culture, and Hindus in India are definitely not and obviously Marxist. It's only the Judeo-Christian cultures that are like, no, please don't. I don't want to be called an Islamophobe. I don't want to be called to this and to that. So how do we talk about these things with confidence, without embarrassment and fear, and mainstream it so we can start debating what we're going to do about the dissolution and dilution of our cultural base and the wiping out of Western civilization in general or entirely or whatever?
Well, the West has paralyzed itself by its adherence to the doctrine of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is a word which has been much misunderstood. People tend to think, well, it just means being nice to each other and respecting other cultures. Well, that's not true. We should all do it. That should be, that's part of a civilized society. Multiculturalism says something quite different. It says that all cultures are equal to each other. And so no culture can say that it's better than any other. And therefore, the West cannot say that the Jewish and Christian values that it stands for, that are its foundational values, are any better than any other culture. And consequently, it no longer can assert those things. So you can't go around saying, equality for women is better than societies where they have no equality for women, or societies where they have no equality for women are much worse than ours, or societies where they have no freedom of religion are far worse than ours, and so on and so on. You can't say that. And so we've been unable to say these things. We've been unable even to have this discussion because we cannot sort of get off the starting block. And, it was a sort of foundational creed, if you like, of liberalism. I mean, when I say liberalism, I don't mean leftism, which I know in America these two things are fairly synonymous. But when I talk about liberalism, I mean old-fashioned, traditional liberalism that came out of the 18th century, John Locke and all that sort of thing, which was to do with tolerance. And what that was the settlement that we all understood that was defined the West until a few decades ago. And what that meant was that a society, that the society in the West should tolerate other cultures and other creeds. It should welcome them in and say that they are welcome to come and practice their religion, worship their god or gods, do their own thing, form cultural communities of faith or to do with their own ethnicity. And that was fine, provided they all signed up to the overarching fundamental moral and political creed of the host society. And that was, that's the deal that all minorities live by, except for one, which is the Islamic world, because its creed tells it that it cannot. If you are a religious Muslim, your religion tells you that there can be no authority, no secular authority higher than the Sharia law. And consequently, the society that you're living in has to adapt to you, it has to adapt to Islam, not the other way around. And that's the particular problem with that particular culture. But beyond that, separate from that, the West has not been able to celebrate and adhere to and promote, let alone defend, its own fundamental precepts. Because, for the reasons that we've been discussing, it doesn't know what they are, doesn't know where they came from, it's ashamed of them, it misunderstands them, it gives them bad PR, and so on. And what I'm saying in the book, among other things, is that what we all have to do is to reverse that. What the West needs to do is to have leaders, brackets, where are they? But that's another issue. But this basically requires leadership. Our cultural leaders in the West have either ignored this or taken us in the wrong direction. And what we need is leaders, both political, theological, social, cultural, artistic, the whole lot. We need leaders to actually stand up and start celebrating what the West is, and to start taking head on some of the shibboleths about religion, So, for example, I say in the book, religion needs a PR makeover. And I'm thinking specifically of Britain, which is particularly godless, as I said. Well, this idea, particularly in Britain, but in the secular world, that religion is bunk because all educated people know it's rubbish, because they know that it's basically it's based on sort of superstitious mumbo jumbo, as opposed to science, which is reality. And this is not only absurd and uneducated and wrong, but it can be shown to be wrong. We can show that some of the most stupid and illogical and irrational and absurd statements are made by atheists trying to for example, to rationalize one of their core contradictions, which is this: that they say, on the one hand, the scientific reality dictates that nothing can come of nothing. At the same time, all life, all existence came from nothing. Now, these two statements are completely contradictory. And a number of atheistic scientists have tied themselves up in absurd knots trying to marry the two. We can show, proper leadership could show that this is an absurdity in the atheistic world. It is not true that atheism has all the good lines, that atheism is actually educated and sensible and rational and realistic, whereas religion is not. You can show the opposite. And you can also show that, a lot of people who are very, they have storied careers in intellectual circles. They are scientists, they are philosophers, they are thinkers, and they are religious people. And one can point to them to say, or use them to say, this is how they think. And you can see that they're not stupid at all. They are actually far smarter than many people who are secular, who are atheistic. Things like that. But it needs leadership. It needs a leadership that has confidence to speak in this kind of language, to take on the shibboleth of the age.
Yes, it seems to me, well, not seems to me, it's so clearly obvious that Great Britain is starting a reform, right? A reform movement there is starting from a very different place than we are in America, obviously, and all of Europe, or much of Europe, is as well, because we don't reject religion here at all. I mean, it's just, it's everywhere. And we can speak very loud and proud, and we're not ashamed of talking about religion at all. As a matter of fact, you can watch, say, the news all day long and see newscasters calling on the name of God, right in the middle of a news broadcast to discuss something that's just happened or what have you. So you're in a very different situation there. And I've prayed for Great Britain, and I've actually posted on X prayers for you guys out there, because I feel so sorry for a country that is suiciding itself and rejecting this great tradition, history, and beauty, and, language, literature, all of this culture, utterly rejecting it and doing it in such a way that is so clueless, and that's embarrassing, that they don't know that when there's a void of religion and a solid worldview, that another religion has to come in. So they feel as if they've been freed from the constraints of religion, and in reality, it's impossible for a culture to stay there. And whoever is going to be, whatever religion and population is going to be aggressive and determined enough, will replace the religion, will fill that religious void. They had, Britain, the religion that gave them all of the liberties and the glorious culture that they assume is the way it's going to be forever. And now they're going to be brought into the Sharia, and that's going to be a cold splash in the face someday. And it's already happening.
It's true, but I think that, and you're absolutely right. There is a very big difference from America, but America, I think, is not free of this at all, because I see it as there's a different pattern going on here. If you look at Britain and Europe, it seems to me it's a kind of glide. There's a sort of over many decades, in fact, I would say centuries, but certainly many decades. It's a slide down, quite gentle, but it's a slide. And the whole society is sliding because there is not really an organized pushback in terms of in cultural terms. There's a certain amount of pushback in political terms. We've seen the rise of so-called populist politicians and parties in both Britain and in Europe, representing the fact that millions of people in the general public are fed up with having their nation and their culture taken away from them. And so they're voting against the mainstream political establishment across left and right, as conventionally understood, as having failed them in this respect, in not having defended and stood up for Western civilization, Western culture, the nation state, and its foundational values, and so on. So it's being expressed in political terms to a certain extent, but in cultural terms, it's a slide. Now, if you look at America, it seems to me, you have a different situation there completely. You have a real fight. You do have a culture war.
Oh, yeah.
With two sides, very, very clear two sides. And we all know about President Trump. We all know about the Democratic Party. Whichever side, whichever way your inclinations take you, there are clearly two sides. And it seems to me that the Democratic Party embodies. I'm sure there are religious people in the Democratic Party. I'm not trying to say that there aren't. But if you look at their political worldview, it is a very secular worldview in that it has embraced the ideologies of the secular, Marxist-based, anti-nation state, anti-Jewish, anti-Christian culture left wing of politics. And you look at, the Obama administration, the Biden administration, you can see the kind of assumptions they have about how the world should be organized, both at home and abroad, which are inimical to Jewish and Christian values. And then you have, on the other side, the Republican side, which has produced Donald Trump, because the Republicans, the Republican establishment had gone to a certain extent down the same road. So you have an outlier like Donald Trump, who is a great disruptor, as we can see. And that's because people, on that side were so desperate about what the left was doing to America. So what I'm saying is that you have in America a fight, a political fight and a cultural fight. It's engaged. The two sides are engaged in a struggle against each other. I don't know how that's going to end up, but it's a very different situation from Britain and Europe.
Right. I wasn't trying to imply that America's not in quite the same existential crisis, because I think it is. We battle differently in America, and it's going to be a battle royale. I see Tommy Robinson in prison where a gang rapist is out on the streets. Okay. And no matter what, or let's put it this way, I see in Great Britain that many probably very nice people, it may be you included, I don't know. I'm just saying that because he's in prison because he actually broke some law or defied a court, that he's sort of anathema. But then I think of what his attempt was, whether he perfectly executed it or not, was to expose the incredible corruption in the political, legal policing system that was allowing the industrial scale rape and even
no. I'm sorry, you're wrong. I'm sorry, you're quite wrong on this. I know many Americans think this.
Okay,
I'm afraid you've all been taken in by his spin. It's completely untrue.
Oh,
he did not expose anything at all. It was exposed, many years ago by my colleague at the Times, in fact, who brought it into the public domain. It is true that it was and is a great scandal. That is true. What happened was that for a number of years, at least 10 years, probably more, none of us quite knows, but anyway, let's say at least 10 years, this terrible business of the rape and pimping gangs was going on, and it was concealed between the police and the welfare agencies because they were frightened of being called racist, not Islamophobic. They didn't think of it as Muslim. They thought of it as being because these gangs were mainly Pakistani heritage men. They thought they would be called racist. And the police also thought that these girls, they were very young, 13, 14, 15, 16, but they came mainly from the wrong side of the tracks. They came from very, very bad family backgrounds. A lot of them were in local authority care. And the police thought they were little prostitutes. And so they didn't care about them. And so they didn't see them as children. So for at least 10 years, this was going on. And it was indeed terrible. There was a Labour Party member of Parliament who very bravely stood up and tried to blow the whistle on this. And she was denounced and vilified. There was a very brave detective who tried to do the same, and she was also denounced and vilified. So it was a terrible thing, and it was finally brought to public attention by my colleague at the Times, who produced a series of pieces in the paper, and people were very shocked and very horrified, and he wrote about it consistently. And as a result of that, dozens and dozens and dozens of these men have been brought to trial and jailed. Now, there have been a number of public inquiries and local and national inquiries about this, and a number of men have been jailed. The response, however, has been wholly inadequate given the scale of what's been happening. I mean, we're talking about tens of thousands of young girls who were picked on. They were not just they were pimped. They were seduced. They were pimped. They were raped. They were tortured. One or two of them were actually killed. So a scandal of that nature, you would have thought, would be a cultural crisis for a properly organized society. And it hasn't been. People have been shocked. They've been sort of saying, tut, 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 and then it's all died down again. And I'm afraid it continues because the fundamental problem, which is that a culture which has produced this is not prepared to tackle it, and no one's prepared to call it out. So that is all true. But the man you called Tommy Robinson, whose name is Stephen Yaxley Lennon, Tommy Robinson was the name he gave himself as a nom de guerre when he was a football hooligan. He was a former member of the British...
And Melanie, what I didn't mean to do is I'm not trying to defend everything about Tommy or whatever. Yeah. I call him Tommy Robinson because that's the name I know him by. But I really don't mean, like when he was a football hooligan and everything, I wasn't really trying to say that. I should probably rephrase this and just say that to me and to some other people, I would assume there's somebody other than myself that believes this, that the police and the social workers and the people in the ministries acted criminally, and they will never see justice. That allowed girls to be tortured, raped, and basically in a sort of a sense of trafficked, and it's a form of slavery, in a sense, and to allow that to happen. Those people will never see a prison walls, and
that's not true because dozens of them are in jail.
Oh, are they? Oh, that's very good.
Well, the perpetrators are not.
Oh
the
no,
police.
I'm talking about the fact
thousands
that
of perpetrators are in jail.
I do know that. I do know that. I'm sure it hasn't scratched the surface yet. I just meant to say that I didn't even know where I started with this conversation. I threw that out of left field. Or that came out of left field, or maybe I threw it there. Anyway, what I mean to say is that in a culture, we shouldn't have two-tier policing and two-tier justice system. And what I see is that when, I don't even want to bring up his name again, but when people are silenced when people are angry and go out into the street because they're angry about the suppression and the violence and the gaslighting from their government for years and years and years because of these very things, not wanting to be called a racist or an Islamophobe, and then they do something either foolish or not something that's just a matter of free speech, and then they're put into prisons. But the people that aided and abetted rape gangs, it's really a cartel. It's really organized crime. And they will never see the inside. Most of them, if any, will ever see the inside of a prison sentence. And a prison cell. And some of this goes back to what we're talking about as far as civilization is concerned. The inversion of morality, the throwing of the guy in prison who tweeted something that was offensive in prison, and then allowing the people that allowed perpetrators to run ragged and abuse and destroy the hearts and minds of young girls to go unpunished. This is an inversion of reality and morality and values, and that's what happened on October 8th. And I think that's what happens to every culture that rejects its fundamental religious base or core beliefs and then becomes confused, and they're unable to even act rationally and morally any longer on a consistent basis.
Yes, there is a lot of inversion going on. There's a lot of confusion, put it mildly, among the police in Britain as a result of years of this kind of confusion over what's called hate crime, which is actually the policing of dissent. Mm-hmm. And the police have got themselves in a terrible state over this. But it's in a way not their fault, because they are simply responding to a cultural trend that's been there politically for many years, expressed through laws that are on the statute book. So it's not surprising that they are confused. But you have a situation where morality goes out the window, and society becomes confused, and then you find that the police are no longer policing what they should be policing. That is absolutely correct. Having said that, again, people have different agendas, and the people who are talking about all this on social media, and a lot of this has gone straight to America, and Americans, I'm afraid, have just believed all of it. What's been obscured is that some of these people who have been jailed or arrested and in some way disciplined or punished as a result of what they have done, of what have said on social media, some of them, have been acting completely unacceptably. For example, there was someone, who I think it was a woman, who was threatening to burn down all the mosques.
You that's horrible. No, Britain. You can't have that. That's part of it. That's part of it, you see. But that's criminal behavior. And then there's freedom of speech, and then there's criminal behavior.
Yes. So the police have definitely overstepped the mark on a number of occasions. There is definitely a great confusion, as you say. But at the same time, people are behaving in a way that anybody should find completely unacceptable.
Absolutely.
So it's a more complicated situation.
I recognize that, Melanie, but I think what happens is this. Chaos is brought into a society, whether it's a deliberate attempt and plan, or whether it's just, I don't know how you can be so buffoonishly stupid to not know that a mass migration of millions of men, military-age men from North Africa and the Middle East into little England or Great Britain wouldn't cause a cultural chaos, and that is exactly what has happened. But it's been happening for maybe even decades, at least a decade or two. And that chaos is what then results from this kind of a move of not respecting culture and civilization and the boundaries and how to preserve a culture. And then people start behaving very badly in reaction because they keep voting into conservatives in England who say they're going to bring it down to 10,000 a year, 10% of, immigration. And then 10 years go by and they've only increased it to 750,000 a year being immigrated in. The whole society is falling apart. And to some people, I think they start losing their minds. It's as if they feel that there's no choice. And this is very, very wrong. I do not agree with this, but I think some people just lose it. I mean, to threaten to burn down all these mosques, but what they're seeing is the introduction of a religion that allows for this kind of behavior in their society, and they lose it. And I think that you have to kind of go back. You talked about causes in the very first, in the introduction or the letter to the reader. Like, are we looking at the causes of the problems instead of just the symptoms or the,
yes,
exactly. And so the causes are, I think that you and America is just starting this pretty much, but most of Europe into kind of surrendering the culture and saying our culture doesn't matter. Just come in and we'll be an Islamic culture. Do you see, like in 30 years, wouldn't England be an Islamic culture?
I think it's unwise to make predictions.
True.
We don't know what's going to happen. Certainly that's the drift at the moment. That's the trajectory of the drift that's been happening. But, there are millions and millions of people in Britain and in Europe who see what's happening and who are becoming agitated and angry. In a democracy, one hopes that eventually even the most timid of ruling groups will actually do something about this. But it's very hard because you need to have absolute confidence in what you're doing to tackle it. And the problem is not simply a matter of lack of courage, although that is a very significant problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's more that you can't expect people to have courage if they don't even understand what it is they're about to lose. So, there are so many people in Britain and Europe who have signed up to what I would call as a universalist vision, which basically denigrates the importance of the nation state and its democratically elected representative institutions, and in the belief that actually it's much better to have universal laws, human rights laws, transnational institutions such as the United Nations or the International Criminal Court, which can bring people together rather than nations which divide people. Now, you've got a lot of people in Europe who really have signed up to that way of thinking. And I think a lot of people in the Democratic Party also sign up to that way of thinking as well. And that's the problem, that you can't expect people to have the courage to tackle the undermining. You can't expect them to have the courage to tackle those people who are undermining their culture if they themselves don't even rate it that much. So, you have to start this by reinvigorating people's understanding of and love for their own society and their own culture and their own basic cultural principles. Then you have to have the courage to act upon that. And my goodness, it's becoming a tough call because you're dealing with numbers of people who are potentially very violent. And in Britain, I can't speak for Europe, but I'm pretty sure it's the same in Europe. Certainly in Britain, the governing class across parties has been terrified of this. But
Are they
but the
afraid?
trouble is they would, when it was less of a problem.
So to me, it's just cowardly and spineless, and and I'm not talking about the average Joe, as we would say out on the street, but when I look across the elites in Europe and Britain, and I think, are you that afraid of Islam?
Yeah, they
I
are.
mean, are you, like,
They are.
that's bad. When I see the bobbies, I kind of joke about it, because in America, you just see people with lots of guns. If there's a problem, there's going to be guns everywhere, the policing. And I see these things happening downtown London, where women are basically going up and men saying, "Stop," like, "I'm the police." It's so, like, there's no way to enforce anything. And that's why sometimes I think they go after Jews and Christians, because they know they could at least arrest them and be able to take them away easily out on the street in these demonstrations. But I'll look at them and I'll think, this is what I'm watching, say, videos of these actions on the actual streets in London. And I think, are you afraid? I think they've instilled a fear of one offending, but a fear of actually enforcing the law when it comes to Islam and Muslims. And I think that is just a sort of a canary in the coal mine kind of a moment too. It's sort of a warning signal that this is going to get really bad, because your politicians are afraid of Islam, and that is seeping down into your policing, which is your first line of defense if there is any kind of violence that's going to really be breaking out, because obviously the politicians are afraid of that violence. They're afraid of Islam. Well, it's got to be of the potential for violence. But their police, go ahead.
I think people across the world are frightened of it because of the numbers. What is it, 1.8 billion?
Yes. Christianity is about 2.3, 2.4 billion.
Well, whatever. I mean, the numbers are huge. And you have, a dominant interpretation of Islam that seek to subjugate everybody else. I think it's very important to bear in mind that certainly in Britain, I can really only speak about Britain from this point of view.
Right.
In Britain, there are lots and lots of what I would call cultural Muslims who are no problem at all. They were born in Britain, or they've come from Muslim countries. They come from Muslim families. They're kind of cultural Muslims. They're not religious. They completely sign up to the British way of life, to Western values. It's part of them. They value them. They value these principles. They live by them. They're not a problem. And that's why I use the term Islamist to mean political Islam, i.e. the interpretation of the religion which says we've got to go and Islamize and subjugate the non-Islamic world and make it Islamic. And there are far too many of them.
I mean,
sure, but if you're not a religious Muslim, you don't care about what's in the Quran.
Right.
But still be a Muslim, because that's how you were brought up. And the numbers are unsustainable. The numbers who actually wish to subjugate Britain and to Islam, and the numbers who are not just want to happen, but actually pose an actual threat, are unsustainable. The security service cannot deal with them all. There are too many.
There's 50,000 on your terror watch list in the UK. 50,000. That's a big, fat number.
I did about 50,000. But anyway, the 80% of the security services most urgent watch list are Islamic radicals.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about a very, very serious problem indeed. I think personally, it's like all bullies in a way. They take advantage of weakness. We saw that in America when America decided that it was no longer going to defend itself and to defend freedom in the world. every tyrant in the world said, whoopee, now we're motoring, including the Islamists.
True.
And it's the same with the defenders of a culture within a society. If you basically show that, you're not even going to fight for our stuff, then the people who are predatory will be heartened and incentivized and move in and so on. You have to push them back. And I think it can be done, even now, even though the numbers are so large. I think it can be done and should be done. But it's not being done, and it won't be done because people are... they have their heads in the sand. We understand they're frightened. We understand they're timid. Okay, fine. But what do they think is going to happen? By continuing along these lines, it's not going to go away. And yet they sort of tell themselves, well, it's something we simply can't deal with.
I don't blame them in the sense that when I feel like I have this window only because I watch so much of what's coming, like GB news, and I just watch everything that's coming out of Britain because I care very much about what happens to y'all and what happens to Western civilization. And I wonder, you made a point that I thought was just well said. It was just so simple. You cannot have a multicultural society. It is it's an oxymoron. You can have a multi-ethnic society, but you can't have a multicultural society. And in that perfect brevity, you said it all. Why don't you just expand on that and explain? Because I think this is what people don't understand. So much of what a lack of response or a good response to the problems that we're facing is a lack of understanding, because they think, well, multiculturalism, I mean, what are you saying? You don't want people that are brown, or you don't want people that, no, it's, so they see it as one thing and out of ignorance, but you explain it.
Yeah. Well, indeed, people think that multiculturalism means simply being tolerant of other people, and it doesn't. We should all be tolerant of other people. Multiculturalism means you can't stand up for one culture over another. You can't stand up for Western culture. Now, that means that you have to accept, if you are a multiculturalist, then you basically accept, or want to happen, what you want to happen is that instead of there being a culture that defines Britain or whatever country you're in, let's say Britain, instead of having a culture that defines Britain, which is Britain's traditional culture passed down through history, embedded in its language, in its literature, in its morality, in its religion, in its civic arrangements, in its political arrangements, and so on. Instead of having one culture with a set of overarching principles, if you can't say that culture must have sway over any other culture because it's better than any other culture, then you have to accept that Britain becomes balkanized into a series of tribal arrangements, groups that define themselves according to their own culture, their own religion, and that therefore seek to have power over each other because they want to be dominant, and even if they don't want to be dominant, they are jostling for bits of the national pie. It doesn't work. Multiculturalism is a source for division, divisiveness. Almost by definition, it means that you cannot have one law for all, because you have multicultures. You have pious Muslims who wish to live under Sharia. Sharia law does not accept the superiority or the superior authority of any secular law, and consequently, they have to live under Sharia law, so they will be distinct. So immediately, you have destroyed one of the core precepts of a free, democratic Western society, which is that everybody is answerable to the same law. It is one law for all. You can't uphold that in a multicultural society. So there's no such thing as a multicultural society. A society is a thing. It is one thing. It is a coherent body of people. It is a body of people who live by a coherent set of principles, overarching principles, within which, as I say, in a liberal society, you can permit and certainly accept and even welcome individual groupings that do their own thing, but under an overarching umbrella, which is the foundational values of that culture. Now, if you have a multicultural society, you don't have a society because there is no one culture to bind everybody together. You don't have a society at all. You have a geographical entity consisting of separate tribes or separate groups. And so it's not a society at all. It is a contradiction in terms. That's what I was saying in the book.
Exactly. And if you look at a tribal map of Iraq, for instance, which has, and the reason why they could only have a despotic, tyrannical government is because there's 100 tribes. There's an actual, you could literally look at all the tribes and it looks like a patchwork quilt of tiny little tribes everywhere. Quite. The reason it cannot be sustained ever without a strong ruler, a strong man, is because...
Exactly.
Right. And that's what's going to happen, God forbid, to England or, Great Britain if it doesn't change. If you could go back 25 years and say, okay, there's persecuted Christians in Pakistan, persecuted Christians and Jews and Yazidis and whatever in Iraq and in Turkey. And you can just go through all of the Middle East and North Africa, all these poor people. And if you could, to illustrate the difference between a multicultural society, which is not a thing, it's actually, I call it a cult, and a multi-ethnic society. If you could go back 20, 30 years and say, okay, we're going to bring in people from Pakistan and Egypt and Congo and wherever, but we'll bring in the Christians and the Jews. This is where it gets tough for some people. I'm not going to let that hold me back anymore. Would England look different now? It would be multi-ethnic, but it would not be, in essence, multicultural if the people that you brought in, even though Pakistani Christians are not one for one the same as a Londoner Christian or a French Christian. Throwing out that hypothetical, how would UK, Great Britain look different today?
Oh, well, it would obviously look very different because it wouldn't be taking in the non-white cultures that it's taken in, and non-Christian cultures, non-Jewish cultures.
No, but I don't mean non-white. I mean, bring the Christians are in Pakistan. They're persecuted, right? They're in Congo. They're all over the world or all over the Middle East and North Africa. So it doesn't matter what color. You're just bringing in Christians instead of Muslim.
Well, they would have upheld the core values of the culture. Yeah, that's what would have happened.
And that's really the basis of all of this discussion that people are afraid to have because they don't want to hurt somebody's feelings or they don't want to be doxxed and canceled and to look like, some kind of xenophobic, nativistic, all these, pejoratives that are put on people. But the reality is, if either England, I don't know why I'm calling y'all England all the time now. Either the UK is going to be a British, an Irish and Wales, Christian nation or formerly Christian nation that still clings to that, or it's going to be a Muslim nation eventually. Either or.
Yes. The real problem is that they didn't lay down red lines because they didn't want to understand it. They didn't understand it. They didn't want to understand what they were up against when it came to Islam. They didn't understand that, for example, Sharia law is, in my view, completely subversive of the state and would undoubtedly lead to tribal enclaves. And they didn't understand that they needed to crack down immediately on Islamic extremism. So to this day, they have not outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm not sure whether it's even outlawed in America.
It's not yet. We're hoping for that to happen in this term.
Well, maybe it will happen, but that's a very, very bad mistake. It's the same mistake. It's exactly the same mistake. Your CARE, the Council for American Islamic Relations, whatever it is a terrible organization.
Subversive.
Right, and it seeded itself throughout the administration and throughout the culture in America in a very similar way to the way in which the Brotherhood has. Sorry, I'm just adjusting my light here. It should have gone off. Has seeded itself through Britain. So red lines. No Sharia. Extremist preachers in mosques completely out of the country or in prison. Outlaw the Muslim Brotherhood. Outlaw the Iranian
Shia
extremist organization, which they are run
IRCG.
by Iran. Exactly. The Revolutionary Guard Corps is not outlawed in Britain even today.
Wow.
Things like that. These red lines, if they had been established, you could have Muslims in Britain. There's not a problem. Not a problem. They can do their own thing. They can worship their own God. If it's a private matter, the problem is when they impinge on the public square and say that the country that they're living in has to adapt to it, and so you have to crack down on all of that. That's what they didn't do. I think they could still do it.
Do you think so?
Oh yes, of course they could. Of course they could.
Interesting.
They would say it's far too dangerous, too difficult. It would create riots. Oh, okay. So maybe so. In which case you deal with it, because what's the alternative?
You're
they
held
won't
hostage.
ever face what's coming. They won't face what's coming. They won't take their minds further forward as to So what follows? This is a council of despair. It is defeatism. And what follows from that is, well, if you say that you can't win this, okay, so you lose. So it's a surrender. So it's over. Is that what you're saying? And they will say, oh, we're not saying that at all. I mean, they're not having even the discussion.
We started off talking about how the persecution of Jews in a Western society, I don't know what you call it in a Middle Eastern society other than Israel, but in a Western society, the persecution of Jews is a bellwether. It tells you that the society is in deep decline, and I would say that it is truly related to biblical understanding, to the faith of the people within the society. European Christianity is different than American. It is different because we don't have the same history that Spain and, very many of the states there had, and then leading up to the Holocaust, and still so much ingrained in anti-Semitism. So we have a very different situation here in America. But if you lose your biblical literacy, if you don't read your scriptures, if you don't know your scriptures, then you can't understand why it is so important that we protect our culture as it is founded on our faith, our religion, our holy scriptures, because the truth is within those scriptures. I'll say that. It is not in the Quran. The truth is in the Torah, the prophets, and I would say, of course, the Gospels and the Apostles, but we share one Bible, and we share 78%. We have 78% of our Bible is the Hebrew Scriptures. And if we lose that, then that is not just only to the detriment of Christianity and the Western civilization, but of the Jews as well. And this canary in the coal mine thing, where a society is doomed I think a lot of people don't understand where that comes from because it's biblical. Because it could seem just random. So somebody hears you say, well, the Holocaust or persecution of the Jews or October 7th or October 8th, the reaction to October 7th, that is a canary in the coal mines. Your culture is going down because the persecution of Jews are going to signify that a society is in deep trouble. And somebody says, why? Why not being the persecution of Filipinos or the persecution of the Japanese in your society, right? Or the, Hindus. And I would say this is because that from the very beginning, from the Torah, through the Gospels and the epistles of the apostles, the Bible says that we are to love and bless the Jews. And if we love the one God, then we want to love what he loves and we want to obey that command. And in that great first foundational covenant with Israel, with Abraham, actually, he says, and I will bless you and make you and multiply you, but I will, those who curse you, I will curse, and those who bless you, I will bless. And that was an extraordinary thing. Talk about extraordinary things in history, that God Almighty is talking to Abraham and he's saying, I'm doing this covenant with you, but by extension, the entire world. If you choose out there in the world, all the rest of the nations, by the way, God invented the nations, not mankind in the 19th century. But if you persecute my people, I am going to judge you. And Jesus said that. He said in Judgment Day that all the nations will be judged based on how they treated his brethren, Israel. And that's throughout the whole scriptures. And it's told not just to Abraham, but to Israel proper, the children of Israel, and it's throughout the New Testament. So I think that is the logical underpinning that people can understand, that if you look in the Middle East where Jews have been persecuted for so long, and you look at what happened to Germany and other countries that, went on tirades of bloodthirsty anti-Semitic behavior, there was always a consequence to the culture.
Yeah, but I mean, I've just written about something which you sure will have seen, this latest Gallup poll, which shows that only 46% now of Americans support Israel over the Palestinians. This is catastrophic. It was axiomatic because America is a scripturally faithful country, and because the principles of the Bible and of Hebrew scripture in particular are so imprinted on the American Constitution and its identity as a nation. It's been axiomatic that America is the greatest supporter of Israel in the world, with an emotional commitment to Israel that, in my personal view, exceeds the emotional commitment of many diaspora Jews, actually.
Agreed. I know
right?
how I feel.
Right. So now, I mean, my goodness me, 46% only. And it's been going, this is not just a blip, it's been going down steadily. Now, what is the explanation for this? Well, Gallup itself says, these are the very latest figures for this year. And it's clearly influenced, they say, by the Israel-Hamas war, feeling about that, okay? And it's influenced by the divisive personality of Donald Trump. Okay, let's assume that is, that those things have had some degree of influence, but it's clearly nonsense because this decline has been, as they say, going on for a number of years. And it seems to me, if you look then further at what Gallup found, what it found was that there's been an absolutely precipitous drop in support for Israel in the Democratic Party. Now, Democratic Party was always, a party of the liberal left. Okay, fine. But nevertheless, it was, the majority of Democrats, as far as I can see, for a long time, have been very solid for Israel. Okay, we can all sort of, argue about whether they really did the right thing by Israel in terms of a successive Democrat administration. But nevertheless, the Democratic Party overall was basically a pro-Israel party because America was pro-Israel.
Absolutely.
And so this drop to 46% has been fueled, as far as I can see, by this catastrophic drop in among the Democrats. So,
because the Republicans got to be around 75% still, right?
It's absolutely a mirror image. I've forgotten what the figure is, but it's at least 75%, and it's something like 10% of Republicans prefer the Palestinian narrative to the Israeli narrative. But my point is this: that what you're saying about Britain and Europe is all too true, and it kind of sui generis. It's not the same as it is in America, and America is still, it still has this very significant, biblically faithful block of people who are fighting for these values in a way that's not the case in Britain and Europe. However, the influence of the Democratic Party's worldview is increasing. I would say carried through the universities as more and more people come through the universities. It's like a poison. The universities are the crucible of this poison that is seeping through the whole culture, and it's now infecting more and more people in America. And this is the fight that you have. It's not the same fight. It takes a different form. It's not as urgent. It's not as difficult. It's not as dangerous, or whatever word you want to use, as it is in Britain and Europe. However, you got it. It's the same, basically the same thing.
Absolutely, and you're right. And I think most people recognize that the billions of dollars coming in from Qatar and other Islamic nations, but also the Marxist effect, because the Marxists were embedded into the university campuses long ago, and they've destroyed the minds of generations. And now we have the Islamists doing the same thing. And boy, what a toxic mix that is.
Yeah,
and so, but look, the interesting thing about it is the Democrats, I'd say. Okay, maybe you're not comfortable with this. I'm very comfortable with it. I believe that when God set down this covenant 3,500 years, 4,000 years ago with Abraham, he meant it. It was continued. When Yeshua, is saying the same thing, and he's saying that nations will be judged on how they have treated my brethren. All right? That's a promise he's making there. And I believe the Democrat Party is like a perfect illustration of what happens when you abandon God's commands and you curse the Jews.
Well,
The Democrats, you look at it and this last year, I keep thinking, no, this is an act of God. Actually, since October 7th, I've been thinking, how could anybody be making these decisions? God must be hardening their hearts just like Pharaoh, because this is so insane. Because Pharaoh was so evil, God hardened his heart further. And the Democrats have been doing the most inexplicable things, and they still are. But that's because I believe they've abandoned all biblical truth. They've abandoned God.
I think so.
And they've abandoned the Jewish people. And we have been Zionists in America. John Adams was an ardent Zionist. And John Quincy Adams said, I want the Jews back in Judea. I want them. And John Adams said that the Hebrew people brought more to civilize, the Hebrew people, the nation, have brought more to civilize mankind than any other nation on the face of the earth. Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt. You can go through all of them. Nobody knows that stuff. 99% of Americans don't know that, but we've been Zionists from the beginning. Now, of course, we hear that the Jews control America. We have been captured. The reality is we've loved Israel since before our official founding in 1776, etc. We've loved them forever. And that's why I believe that we are blessed, because we certainly, our nation has committed enough sins to deserve judgment of God, but we have stayed true, not perfectly, true to Israel. And I think that's why I never even thought about, that's why the Democrats, until you brought that up, that's why the Democrats are down, and they're going to be down for a long time. Well, I think that America needs to remain strong in this so that we are continually blessed, so that we can be a refuge for British, persecuted Brits, persecuted French and Germans, people around the world who are being persecuted. And I believe it's important that we do not become a Muslim nation. I believe that it's important that there's an America. And do you think that we need to look at our immigration like Britain and say we need to restrict immigration from the Middle East and North Africa and maybe do a moratorium so that we can settle if we're going to save our culture, because culture is so related to religion and law, and both of those things are diametrically opposed to Islam?
Well, you have, of course, got a major immigration crisis and have had on your southern border. It's not an Islamic crisis per se.
No, not yet.
It's it's a Latin American crisis, and many, if not most, of those people are Christian. Are they not? They're Catholic. Are they?
I'm not worried
right?
about the illegal immigration. We're taking care of that. I just mean in terms of demographics is destiny. And if multiculturalism doesn't work, should America, Britain, and Europe right the imbalance and sort of recommit to its Christian heritage, and immigration should be primarily for persecuted Christians from around the world?
Well, it would be nice if persecuted Christians were given priority because they are so badly persecuted. I mean, what Britain has been doing, what Europe's been doing, is taking in the people who are persecuting them, basically. So that's obviously absurd. But I mean, the West cannot take in the persecuted of the world. This is the fundamental error that Europe made, or Germany made, in whenever it was 2016. When Angela Merkel, Chancellor of Germany, threw open her borders and said, "Come in," on the basis that we can take them all. Well, it's not a question of a civil war here, a persecution there. You are bound by civilized values. Take those people, or a significant proportion of those people. But we're talking about something quite different. We're talking about an enormous mass movement, people from south to north, the global south to the global north. And this is unsustainable. We can't do that. And that's what you've had in America, a mass migration. It's unsustainable. It is putting immense pressure on your public services, your capacity to absorb, and it breaks the compact. It breaks the compact between citizen and government because you bring people in and you dissolve what a citizen is all about, which is a mutual bargain. So you have to have, you cannot have a nation. A nation is not a nation unless it has borders. And to have borders, you have to police the borders. If you don't police the borders, you no longer have a nation. That's the first thing. Then you've got a separate issue with taking in people from cultures that will not be assimilated. And if they are from cultures that will not be assimilated, then I think you do have to restrict that. Yes, because otherwise you're committing cultural suicide. So you have to restrict it very carefully to people that you think will assimilate. How do you decide that? Well, that's it's a difficult matter. But you've got to first of all establish the principle that it is not racist to say that. It is culturally suicidal not to say it. And not only is it culturally suicidal, but you are betraying the citizens of your country who expect to be able to live in safety and security within a society with which they identify, with which they have love for and respect for, which they can call their own, they can call home. If you destroy that, you are basically betraying and breaking the compact that you make between government and governed. That is not sustainable. It is not right. It is not on, and you shouldn't do that. So for all these reasons, I think all Western countries have got to radically rethink the basis on which they take people in from other cultures and other societies. Yes, there is a duty to take in the persecuted. Not all of them. If you've got billions of people being persecuted, you simply can't do it. But to take in a significant proportion of people who are being really persecuted, and then to take in people who will act in your national interest. It is in your national interest to take these people in. A country must above all, a nation must above all, in order to fulfill the compact with its own citizens, it must only act in its own interests. And consequently, it cannot and must not commit cultural suicide, which is what the nations are currently doing. So immigration policy, I think, has to be rethought on those grounds.
Yeah, when you think about it, you can't identify what's in the mind and heart of every individual human being. And you don't know what their son and their grandson, because second and third generation Islamism is a thing. The radicalization of the children and the grandchildren are radicals, whereas their parents were not. And so it almost has to be done on a societal basis, because you can't interview every individual. And again, like I said, understand what is in their heart, but you'd have to look at, well, are we going to bring in from Qatar or Egypt or whatever? Are we going to bring people from there? And just say, well, no, because the culture in and of itself is radically opposed to our culture. And we can't identify which person is not going to be that radical. And so we have to actually make those choices. And I hope that Britain and America and all of us make that choice, because you know what? Saudi Arabia, if I asked Mohammed bin Salman MSB, thank you. And if I said, could we'd like 50,000 of our most ardent Christian evangelists and their families want to immigrate to Saudi Arabia, and you would allow them to evangelize and to speak as Christians and open up Christian bookstores and little churches and everything. You're okay with that, right? There isn't one Muslim nation, India wouldn't be okay with it either, that would allow that to happen. But there's no downside for them in the other direction, is there? Because we're afraid to say no and why. And there, all the immigration goes one direction, that's to the West. So we've got to have Saudi Arabia knows what it believes, and it's going to defend its culture to the very end. And we have to be as at least strong as that, I suppose. Well, your book is truly amazing, and I didn't speak that much about it at the beginning. It is The Builder's Stone, which, by the way, I know it's from Psalm 118, and I wasn't sure what message you were sending because I couldn't find it anywhere in the book where you explain what you meant by the Builder's Stone, other than you dedicated it to that. What did you mean by the Builder's Stone?
Well, it is the phrase or the line from Psalm 118, as you say, and it is basically the rough translation in English is the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and the builder's stone for me is the Jewish people. The Jewish people, the most despised and persecuted people on earth, rejected by country after country, culture after culture, diminished by everybody, certainly apart from America, and really disregarded and not regarded as really being of any significance at all. I mean, there are so few Jews in the world. most people have never met a Jew. So why should anyone think about them? So, it's the stone the builders, threw away. But it is the cornerstone. It's the cornerstone of Western civilization. Without the Jewish Bible, without the Hebrew Bible, without Jewish principles, without the Jewish people, the West would not have become the great civilization that it became. And people who consider themselves civilized would not have